everybody. It's so creative. Is that as loud back there as it feels up here? Or is it okay? It's good, okay. So welcome everybody to our, for this semester, our last Trias meeting. Fortunate and happy to have Melissa Febos here, John Zagata, our Trias writer, and we'll introduce her in a second. I just want to say a couple of things, which is to say to thank Trias, Peter, and his foundation, and that allows us to do what we do here, and thank the English department and the post office, and of course to thank Brian, who comes and sells books faithfully, and especially to Sue Gage, who basically makes everything right, which, without which we would look a little ragged. I just want to also say that, so there's one more reading on November 30th, and you'll see images of an exploded AK-47 up all over the place. That's how you'll find out what's going on. Okay, so I won't say anything more about that. But next semester, I just want to say we have a lot of wonderful readings and reading-like events happening. So we have two Trias writers coming. We have a writer, a poet named Laurie Scheck, who also writes fiction, and fiction that reads a lot like nonfiction, and nonfiction that reads a lot like poetry. And she has two recent books, one to do with Frankenstein, one to do with Dostoevsky's, what's the one with Prince Michigan? The Idiot, right, sorry. And they're rather grand, and she works with a graphic artist who finds kind of really interesting graphic equivalents to what's being read. So that'll be a kind of performative thing that'll happen early in March. And then the great Wayne Castenbaum, who does everything, will be here in April. I went to graduate school with Wayne. Wayne was only 21 when he went to graduate school, and basically he spent all his time listening to opera. And it really stood him in good stead. So that's just a pitch to remind yourself that the things that you probably shouldn't be doing, but find yourself really wanting to do and actually doing them in spite of yourself, they'll come in handy to you. Don't worry. They'll be useful. Yeah, I'm all for them anyway. In addition, we're going to have two alums come back and read, a poet and a fiction writer. Matt Lippman and Aaron Tillman will be here sometime in February. And in part, they're going to do a bunch of things. They're going to do stuff with the Abbey Center. But they're also going to talk about how they got to be writers, because we have a little ad hoc series that sputters along, which addresses that. It brings alums back to just say how they kind of got to do the thing that they're now doing. And in our case, things to do with writing. So there'll be that. And we also have a terrific poet. Dana Smith is coming to do the week-long Trias Week of Poetry. And that will be at the very end of March, the last week of March. And then there'll be a poet and a nonfiction writer coming at the very end of the term to do honors and to give a reading as well. So it's a lot. You just keep your eyes peeled, okay? All right, and now I'm done. And I'm going to turn the mic over to John Zagata, who we should give a round of applause to for his great introductions, for his own reading, for the class he's teaching, because he'll be gone in early December because the semester's kind of over. So, John Zagata.
Hi. Recently, it is loud, so it's okay. Where's the speaker? There. Goodness. Okay. Recently, I went to New York City. Now, those of you who are unfamiliar with what we in the know call the Big Apple, will want to listen up, because one of the advantages that I have as a resident of the 5th largest city in Iowa is that I know how to blend in with city folk. The whole introduction's about. You want to dress the part. Nothing, after all, says tourist like someone whose appearance makes them stick out. You can find this official hat of the Big Apple. It's big. You can find this in most of the hipper boutiques in that city's central marketplace. Just stop. Times Square. I bought my hat several years ago, and now whenever I visit the Big Apple, I put it on before I get off the bus. Stop. That way, as soon as I disembark, my fellow city folk will recognize me as one of their own. Oh, the New Yorkers say, he must have taken the bus to Iowa to visit his grandmother. But now he's back here with us, where he belongs. You see, without even saying a word, I have already shown the city folk that I am one of them. This is no different from what you would do if you were visiting, say, Paris, except in that case you would want to put on a beret. Or, for instance, if you're going down to Daytona Beach for the winter break, you want to make sure that you're wearing a t-shirt that says Daytona Beach. Or what if you're just here on campus? You don't want to be in Saga and have everyone wondering whether you're some random student from Syracuse who's trying to score some free toast. No. If you're a guy, you put on your t-shirt that says Hobart. And if you're a woman, apparently you too put on your t-shirt. I think you get my point. What you choose to show the world will tell the world how to interpret the story that is you. Now I've got a secret. Believe it or not, my travel advice is applicable to literature too. Let me show you. Well, I was in the Big Apple last weekend, which is what it's called. I met with a fancy Broadway producer who wants to turn one of my books into a play. The book is called The Lifespan of a Fact, and it's basically about my own back and forth discussions with a fact checker who was hired to research the accuracy of one of my essays. This Broadway producer wants to turn that story into a play about the back and forth discussions between a writer and a fact checker concerning the accuracy of an essay. Or, as the Broadway critics are already starting to call it, Hamilton 2. The Broadway producer invited me to come to watch a table reading from the play's script by 3 notable actors, none of whose names I can share with you yet because their contracts are still being negotiated. But one of them, the woman who will be playing the editor in the play, is best known for her role as Abigail Adams on HBO's miniseries about John Adams, or as my students in class best remember her, the frumpy office worker in Love Actually who has sex with the super hot office worker. Playing the character of John, the writer is a guy who disconcertingly is 20 years older than the actual John. And playing the character of the fact checker is a young actor best known as your generation's favorite British teenage wizard. So they start the play, and it's good. The fact checker says something about the importance of facts, And while I'm sitting there in the audience, I'm really being pulled into his argument and thinking, yeah, that's right. And then the writer says something about the importance of art. And I'm pulled over to his side and I think, I agree with that too. And back and forth we go as an audience, riveted by the realization that we can believe in two competing ideas about a single issue. But what I am personally most amazed by is what I tell my new best friends, Abigail Adams and your generation's favorite British teenage wizard, after the play. I say, you know what was really amazing is that while you were all going back and forth about the importance of facts, I was sitting there thinking, you know, this is really applicable to what's going on with Donald Trump right now. You know, like how we're all really worried about his hostility to facts and how it might end up getting everyone killed. Except the cool thing is that the play never actually says that that's what it's about. You just do your scenes and let me find my own way to the significance of the play. Abigail Adams, who is a professional, laughed politely at my comment and then excused herself so that she could go finish her salad. While your generation's favorite British teenage wizard looked at me with an expression that registered somewhere between thinking that what I had said was a joke and that I was a joke. But because he's British and a professional too, he responded instead by saying, well, yeah, you know, that's how plays work. I had a long bus ride back to Geneva, which gave me time to reflect on your generation's favorite British teenage wizard's wise words. This semester in my class, we've been talking a lot about showing versus telling, and even about a recent article on that subject in which a writer argued that showing versus telling is an outdated and even imperialist approach to making literature, because it assumes that we all have the same universal experiences, and that we therefore interpret the same concrete details in a text in exactly the same way. And in some ways, that writer has a point, because not everyone sees a police car the same way. Not everyone sees a baby and thinks, I want one. Not everyone in this room is even convinced that this hat is evidence that I would make a credible guide to New York City. But where that writer's argument misses the mark is in assuming that the point of showing versus telling is to give every reader the exact same experience. The point of showing versus telling, which is the point of literature, is to give an experience, the possibility for experience. A world on the page that is rich and vivid and well enough stocked with concrete stuff that readers will feel like they can walk right into it and live. And that's really why showing versus telling, however tired it may seem at this point as advice, is the hardest thing for any of us to embrace as writers. Because it's not really about learning how to make strong images. It's about learning how to relinquish control over how any reader interprets the experiences we share. It's about learning how to create something and then give it away. How to share something that feels as true to your experience as you can get it on the page, and then turn it over to a stranger who just might end up finding a whole different truth inside of it. In the end, it's about learning how to be generous. Melissa Febos' new book, Abandon Me, is the most generous collection of essays we've seen in years. Not only because she builds for us the world of a relationship that seems so real that it ends up feeling as erotic and as painful as anything that we might experience ourselves, but because she doesn't insist on being the hero of her own story, nor even its wisest interpreter. Instead, in the words of The New Yorker, Abandon Me is mesmerizingly fearless, captivatingly intimate, and relentlessly curious. Its long, probing, and exquisitely detailed central essay manages to create for us a relationship that initially feels so perfect it's enviable, but which then slowly starts to crumble before our eyes, revealing tiny, crushing flaws, one by one, until, by the end, we're left with nothing. We're abandoned. We're sitting inside the shell of a thing that no longer exists, but which we can still feel the phantom embrace of all around us. It's an experience of loss on the page that feels as exhilarating as it is devastating, precisely because it is on the page. That's hard to do, and it's rare to find. And so it may sound sadistic for me to call that generous, but in literature, I think there is no greater gift. Please welcome Melissa Febos.
I sort of feel like we can all go home now. That was so good. Oh, thank you, John. I usually find introductions to myself pretty excruciating, but that was really entertaining. And I also just want to thank John and David and for bringing me here, and all of you for coming on this dreary night. And especially John's class that I hung out with this morning, who had such smart questions. It was so fun. I mean, it's always fun to be asked about yourself for an hour straight, but it was particularly good. So I was thinking about my reading, and am I going to tell you guys this story? I am. So every time I choose a reading now, it's sort of informed by this experience I had at the beginning of my book tour for this book, which was back in the beginning of March or late February. So in the beginning of the book tour, I was in the Pacific Northwest, which is where my dad happens to live. And my dad is a very sensitive, kind, retired sea captain. And he decided to go out of his way to attend 4 of my readings in a row. And I don't know what you guys know about this book, but it's basically an alternating series of passages that sort of meditate on the challenges of my childhood and the arguable mistakes of my parents, specifically my father, alternated with graphic scenes of lesbian sex. So, curating 4 consecutive readings that were dad rated was not an experience I would like to repeat. He did actually cry in the front row during one of my you should all be memoirists. No, anyway, so after those 4 readings, I was in Portland and I was hanging out with a friend of mine before my reading there, and I was like, oh, I'm so glad to read something that's not dad rated. And she was like, what are you going to read? And I said, I'm either going to read this essay about how much I love hickeys, or I'm going to read this long passage all about weeping during my childhood. And she was like, well, do you think Portland is more of a hickey city or a crying city? And we looked at each other, and I kid you not, in perfect unison, we were like crying. So now, every time I'm planning a reading, I think, is this a hickey audience or a crying audience? So, what do you guys think? That every audience thinks they're a hickey audience. But I happen to know, being a graduate of more than one college program and also a professor, that all colleges are hotbeds of both hickeys and crying, probably an equal amount. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a little bit about hickeys and a little bit about crying. Does that sound okay? Okay. This first part is from an essay called Leave Marks. I had never been a lover who watched, but I watched her. Hands tucked under my back as she bit my ribs, my belly, my breast. As her fingers slid inside me, her mouth latched onto my chest, the blank space just below my clavicle. I stopped watching then, stopped thinking of anything but the drive of her long fingers. After, in the bathroom mirror, flushed and swollen, I leaned in and examined the purple splotch shaped like Rorschach's card 6, the most condensed ink blot of his 10. It is known as the sex card. Are you okay? It's embarrassing, I said after I climbed back onto the bed, but I love hickeys. She laughed and slid her hand on my chest, pressed the mark like a button with her fingertip. It'll fade by Monday. My pleasure notwithstanding to arrive on the college campus where I taught emblazoned with love bites was unthinkable. Even as defiant teenagers, we massaged them with frozen spoons, scrubbed them with dry toothbrushes, held ice packs to our necks as if to cool our racing pulses. I'm writing an essay about hickeys, I told a friend. Ew, she said, and crumpled her face. Curious, I thought. We don't blink at sex as commerce, women's bodies propped across billboards and television screens, the familiar iconography of male lust. We coo at pregnant bellies, sanctify that most blatant acknowledgement of sex, but shame this ephemeral evidence. A hickey is personal. It offers nothing to its witness but recognition. Is our Puritan history so strong in us that to acknowledge touch for pleasure's sake is vulgar? Maybe the hickey reveals other things, parts of our desire we'd rather not see in the light. One family vacation when I was 8, I played in the pool with a halved rubber ball. Turned inside out, we would fling into the air with a satisfying pop. Somehow, characteristically, I managed to suction this apparatus to the very center of my forehead. Look, I crowed to my poolside parents, and then ow, when it popped off my face and splashed into the water. I rubbed my stinging forehead, and when I looked up, my parents dissolved in laughter. Oh, honey, my mother grinned. Look what you did. The rubber hemisphere had left a perfectly circular crimson bruise in the very center of my forehead. You got a hickey on your face, said my dad. What's a hickey, I said. And when he told me, I gaped, incredulous. Why would anyone want to do that? But later, in the hotel bathroom, when I looked in the mirror, I touched the dark mark so gently, leaned in to see it closer, in repulsion, in wonder. At 10, I discovered my neck. It felt like a secret my body had finally told me. A first drink, a light switch, a doorway where a wall had always been. Tracy Barron's mouth tore a hole in the hole between my shoulder and jaw, and water rushed in. That pleasure was a revelation. If this, then what? After baseball practice on a stray couch cushion in my basement, under an old beach towel, Tracy and I played date. Her mouth on my neck, the sound of my mother starting dinner upstairs. Don't stop, I said, for the first time. From the start, my last love had edges, the kind I can't help but touch. For the first year of our relationship, my lover lived with another woman. She lived 2,500 miles away. When I saw her, after weeks of wondering, I was so hungry, I was angry, I was vibrating with fear. My mouth itched to close on her, as if that could make her stay. Tenderness toward the object of our desire becomes an expression of love, partly, I think, because it so defies the nature of want, whose instinct is often less to cuddle than to crush. My want was more gnash than kiss, more eat than embrace. I cared for her, but that kind of desire precludes many kinds of love. Hunger is selfish. I wanted her happiness, and I also wanted to unzip my body and pull her into it, or crawl into hers. It is no accident that we go to the pulse. Lust is an urge to consume, and maybe there's no true expression of it that doesn't imply destruction. I can't say, but even my tenderness for kittens includes an impulse to put them in my mouth. I know I'm not the only one. There are reasons why love bites are the domain of teenagers. For one, amateurism. The first hickey is often a mistake and one that many never make again. In repeat offenses, there enters an element of braggery, the guy who breaks the bed and mistakes it for the best sex ever. Look at us, the splotch-necked teens gloat. We're wild, we have sex. Despite its glorification, sex is most novel to its initiates. The hickey teens are broadcasting old news to the rest of us, their entry into a club whose membership is public. I read now about adolescents sucking on more obvious parts of each other in group activities that seem to preclude the secrecy and innocence of my own unsayable awakening. I don't mourn their lost childhoods. I lost mine at the first opportunity, and sex isn't the only way to do that. but I do remember the vacancy of those earliest and most obvious sex acts. I met desire under that faded beach towel, to the sound of cleats knocking the cement basement floor. What I mean is, the neck is always innocent. The parts of us we cannot see are touched most deeply, are most needing to be seen. I'll leave that one there. So I'm going to read a few passages now from, there are 7 shorter essays that make up the first half of the book, and then the whole second half of the book is one very long essay that some students were assigned, who I talked to this morning. And for those of you, how many of you are writers? If you write, you're a writer. Okay, yeah. Well, I don't know, it depends on who you are, if this is sort of a happy story or a nightmare story, but I thought that this essay was going to be about 40 pages, and then it ended up being 140 pages, which is something that can happen. Anyway, it's broken up into 65 short chapters in a particular order, but I'm not going to read that in order. And if my intention was successful for this, they should still go together, but we'll see. In the small Texas town, the trains ran all day. Each morning, we woke at dawn and sat in an orange chair by the window to watch the sunrise spill its mad colors across that enormous sky. Every sunrise was a carnival of color to the soundtrack of those trains. They barreled across the desert, and their rumble in my chest, the bleat of those whistles, reminded me of the foghorns on the Cape. Whistle is too weak a word. When a human makes such a sound, it expresses only a few things: terrible grief, earth-shattering climax, triumph, or pain. Not broken finger pain, but dying pain, childbirthing pain. That kind of sound is all body, all heart, out of mind. It's ironic that both train whistles and foghorns should evoke such animal feeling, as they both exist specifically for their listeners. Here I come, they say. Get off the tracks if you don't want my 200 tons of steel barreling into your chest. Steer your prow elsewhere if you don't want to wreck against my shore. Not a threat, but a warning. I can't stop myself, so it's up to you, stranger. One afternoon from a nearby cafe table, a local told us a story about a train conductor who'd fallen in love and had his heart broken by a woman in town. Every time he passed through, he'd sound his train's whistle all the way, borrowing its wail for his own, so that the whole town could feel his busted heart hum in their chests, rattle their teeth, shake their skulls. And after that, every time a train passed and I heard that cry, I wondered if it was a warning or wailing or hallelujah. I thought of my own heart, how much I feared her breaking it. It would sound like that, I thought. It would be the only sound I ever heard again. It would be wrecking against the shore of one person for the rest of my life. I feared it so much that I broke my own heart every day that I loved her. I felt it when I watched her reading in the cafe, absent-mindedly scratching her head and twirling a pen with her long fingers. I felt it when we drove 30 miles to swim in a pool of water risen from deep underground, her skin warm and smooth as clay under my hands. On the way back, we stopped at the largest rattlesnake exhibit on the planet, where we paid $5 to 2 petrified men in a warehouse with a hand-painted sign steeped in the rot dirt stench of snake shit, and stood in front of a rattler yellow as a fingernail and thicker than her leg leaned against me, and I whispered that I didn't have any underwear on because I had swam in them, and she laughed and told me a lady should always wear underpants to visit the largest rattlesnake exhibit on the planet. When I made love to her in that chair by the window, dawn glowing her body like a fruit split open to its wet center, I felt it, the way you feel a fall just looking over the edge of a roof. Will you love me forever? She asked me. Yes, I said. I couldn't know, though. When that whistle spills over the desert, you can only hear the call of your own heart. And when I looked at her, I wondered, are you my wrecking shore? Are you my third rail? Or are you my hallelujah? So I will say, in case you don't already know this, that research can can be a very handy form of procrastination. Did you already know that? Did you know that? I read 3 books about the science of crying in preparation for these passages. You'll probably be able to tell how little of it I actually use, but maybe after I read it I can cheer you up with some curious facts about the science of tears. In his Confessions, St. Augustine asks God why tears are so sweet to the sorrowful. Euripides in the Trojan Women asks, how good are the tears, how sweet the dirges. I would rather sing dirges than eat or drink. I too have always had a taste for tears. I was a colicky baby and an emotional child. I cried for the fox and the hound, for baby birds in our backyard, for bullied classmates on the school bus, and most of all, I cried when the captain left. I watched him walk away again, and I sobbed, thinking, come back, come back. I hugged my crying mother, and I thought, I will do anything. When he was gone, I kept a close watch on my mother, who was good at hiding her loneliness, but not good enough. Some days, a panic gripped me that she would never return from the grocery store. I stared at the driveway. Come back, come back. I called her from friends' houses. Pick up, pick up. I decided I needed to toughen up when I turned 8. On the bus on the way home from school, I imagined each of my family members dying. When tears rose in my eyes, I suppressed them. You can't cry, I told myself, or they really will die. Most importantly, I stopped crying when the captain left. I didn't have to try, I just stopped. In fact, I barely remember his departures after the age of 8. When my mother cried, I wrapped my arms around her, dry-eyed. After I stopped crying, I became clumsy. I tumbled downstairs and walked into walls. I tripped upstairs and burned my hands on the stove. I cut my fingers while chopping vegetables, and once I gave myself a paper cut on my eyeball. It's not as bad as it sounds. That's not good, but a therapist once told me that extreme clumsiness in children is a sign of depression. Severely depressed people do not often cry, nor do severely neglected babies. Tears are an essentially hopeful act. Inherent to them is the body's belief that someone is watching. When the psyche gives up hope that those cries will be answered, the tears stop. I was not severely neglected, nor severely depressed, but I did stop hoping for rescue. My mother begged the captain to stop leaving. I woke from dreams, calling his name. But when he was gone, he was gone. No amount of crying could summon him. In my mid-teens, the dry spell ended. The first time I fell in love, I put my favorite PJ Harvey song on repeat and cried all afternoon. That first girlfriend and I would cry like it was a kind of lovemaking, our bodies surging together, damp and entangled. We cried to Kristen Hirsch, Tori Amos, Ani DeFranco, Otis Redding, and Leonard Cohen. Real sorrow needs no soundtrack. Our tears weren't crocodile, but they meant something other than sorrow. Of all my tears, these were the closest to what the Romanian writer E.M. Chiron coined voluptuous suffering in his 1937 work, Tears and Saints. My sobs at 16 were sensual and sweeping. In tears, I inhabited my body with an abandon I could not sexually or in any other way. Studies tell us that women are more prone to tears and melancholia and men to anger. They tell us that we enforce these expressions of feeling by gender, that women's anger has, over centuries, been converted to tears and melancholia. During the time that I was addicted to drugs, I never cried. When I was high, I was high. And the increasing misery that I felt at all other times was the dry kind. Even in the far reaches of my own denial, the enormous kind necessary to pursue any so seriously life-threatening habit, I knew no one could rescue me, that I was the only person who could walk out of that mess, that the only help I could accept was God's. 4 months into loving her, I cried. Once I started, I couldn't stop. It was not voluptuous. It was not ecstatic. It was not sweet, except in the way that a sweet thing is a siren, its call impossible to ignore. Except in the way that a sweet thing, a thing you cannot ignore, can ravage. If sweet means irresistible, then my tears were sweet, but they were not pretty, and they did not taste good. So we talked about this next passage in class this morning, and we had a little conversation about neediness. So I thought maybe I would check in with the rest of you who weren't in class this morning to see how you feel about neediness. Do you feel comfortable with your own needs and asking to have them met? Maybe you're too young to even know what that means. But if the word needy makes your skin crawl, then this is for you. In the past, I never cried over lovers. I never fought with lovers, I never waited for lovers, and I never lost control. My worst fear was to be needy. When I thought about neediness, I felt like there were snakes on me. When I thought about asking for something that someone couldn't or wouldn't give me, I felt like I had stepped in shit. Women who obsessed over men who did not give them what they needed repelled me, as if need were a contagious disease. I looked at the brokenhearted, at the needy, at the unrequited, at women who waited like my mother had waited, and I thought, never. In Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes, the fox desires the grapes. The grapes, however, are out of his reach. So the fox tells himself he does not want the grapes. The grapes make him sick. He convinces himself. When I was still a child, I had decided that grapes weren't so sweet after all. I would rather have lived in a world without the sweetness of grapes than in this world, where grapes were often out of reach and did not lower themselves no matter how hard I cried. At 32, I bit Amaya's lip. That sweet flooded my mouth, and I remembered. I often kidded about the voracious need that must be hiding deep inside me. I sat for hours in therapy sessions searching for my feelings. I wanted to get in touch with them. I thought that when I finally found them, it would be like a reunion with a childhood friend. Emotional, surely, but also sweet. A reward for all my hard work in therapy. I did not think that I was leaving messages for a serial killer. I did not think that my feelings receiving my invitation would arrive on my doorstep like a cabal of mad women and refuse to leave. I thought that the host of the party decided when it ended and her guests went home. But feelings have terrible manners. They are like children or drunks. They are mad. They gorge as the starved will gorge until they are sick, until their stomachs split, as you or I would if we were exiled for 30 years. They do not leave when you want them to. They leave when they are finished. I apologize if that's bad news for anyone. I'm going to just read one more section. And this one also I chose sort of based on our conversation this morning. And, this book, but really I think everything I've ever written is very much about how you can't hide from your past. The best you can do is acknowledge it in the ways that it has formed you and move forward with it. And in the case of this passage, the past was a set of experiences that I wrote about in my first book, and I thought I was not allowed to talk about anymore, but it kept intruding upon the writing of this book, and so finally I let it in. And so this is actually a reinterpretation of a scene that I wrote earlier. All of that to say that you're allowed to change your mind if you sometimes feel like you're not. In my last year of college, I took a job as a dominatrix. At work, I dressed in nurse uniforms and police uniforms and fishnets and corsets like a saloon prostitute in an old western. Men paid me to be a mother, a maid, a customs officer, a nurse, a sadist. Sometimes they paid to hurt me. They paid to want. Doctors, lawyers, janitors, teachers, politicians, husbands, soldiers, holy men, criminals, they brought it to me. They begged. They crawled across floors, they wept, they grasped at my ankles and howled with hunger. They were ecstatic with want, sainted with want, bodies writhing and cringing, burning up on pyres of want, grasping at the wet wick of my body. When I was 22, I saw a woman suspended from a ceiling by hooks dug through the flesh of her back. We were at a party in Manhattan. She went by Lola and I Justine, my namesake, the Marquis de Sade's famous submissive heroine. In a rubber dress and stilettos, I stood on the staircase of a warehouse in Chelsea and tilted my head back. Lola's eyes at half-mast. Her face was beatific, body glittering with makeup and pearly sweat. The stainless steel hooks gathered and lifted the skin over her shoulder blades in two mounds. All of her hung from those two handfuls of flesh. The puncture wounds wept, but Lola didn't. Her body glowed with pain, as if electrified, as if Electra brilliant with relief, with glory, with revenge, with catharticos. She was beautiful. I looked up at her and I imagined my younger self at 11 or 12 years old, standing beside me on that staircase, all those leathered bodies writhing below us. Look, I imagined saying to that girl. Later, when I remembered this, I understood it as a desire to annihilate my own innocence. I had conjured the child in me at her most hurting age, and I showed her something shocking, incomprehensible. I wanted to break that innocence so that she would never be shocked again. Now, I think different. It was a tender impulse, not a violent one, and what I showed her was not incomprehensible. I don't know what hoisted Lola up to those rafters, but I know that she chose it. I know that she glowed like a planet, radiated light and gravity, colors like cosmic gases colliding. When they lowered her, she was just a woman. Her face, slick with sweat, was softer than I had ever seen it, as if she'd just been born. Black hair wet against her forehead, she smiled at me and touched my face with her hot hand. The Catholic monks of Opus Dei, like their 13th century predecessors, practiced self-flagellation and prayer. In India, Pakistan, Iraq, and Iran, some Shiites march in parades, practicing their versions, sometimes with knives, blades, and chains. In Chinese medicine, coins are dragged across the body until blood rises to the surface in great striping hickeys. This treatment is believed to restore the body's balance. In this country, some teenage girls cut themselves with knives and scissors, and few of them describe the urge as one to punish. By the time I looked up at Lola, I had spent hours under tattoo guns, had slid poison needles into my arms, had shoved my own hand down my throat, had flung my body at so many perilous things, but I had never wanted to die. I was not a masochist. What I mean is, the difference between what is holy and what is pathological is sometimes a matter of fashion. What I mean is, maybe I already knew that my own healing would never look like a laying of hands, not the gentle kind. Maybe I wanted to spare that girl the extra hell of believing she was broken. We are all broken, and repair often hurts. And the ways we find to fix ourselves do not always look like fixing. Sometimes they fail, but they're never wrong. Thanks. So, if you guys have any questions, nothing could embarrass me. About writing, or work, or life.
So you talked a little bit at the beginning about what it's like to say very personal things to particular people. What's that decision like to put something very personal out, or to blatantly put something as a memoir, rather than trying to fictionalize it?
Sure. She is asking about the process of deciding to write about something really personal and call it nonfiction, as opposed to drawing the veil of fiction. I think for me, when I start writing something, I promise myself at the outset that no one else ever has to read it. I wouldn't get very far if I didn't, you know. And the process is a pretty private process. And I think for me, you know, I tried writing fiction, and sometimes I still do, but I'm already so inclined to lie to myself that if I give myself the license to change things and make it up, I'm just going to do that, you know? And the process of writing for me is a process of truth-seeking, and so I don't even do well with big menus, you know? Like, I want to know what I am confronting, and I want to sort of be locked in a room with that thing until our business is done. And so for me, fiction affords me too many opportunities to hide from myself or from what I'm really looking for in the work. And so it's not as rewarding as writing nonfiction. And I guess the price of exposing that to other people is worth it for me. But I can say that as much as it's horrifying to have everything in the world that I could never speak aloud before I wrote it, I also have been astounded at the number of people, strangers mostly, who have written to me and said I had the exact same experience, you know? And so I think the experience of writing about things that people don't talk about is incredibly healing for other people. And that's not what I start out with, but it's sort of a happy result, and it's part of the reason that I'm able to keep doing it.
So when you write, I'm just curious if at the beginning you feel uncomfortable writing about yourself, and then does that feeling change, or do you find that, and I say it partly because the delivery is very confident, and the words are very moving, and it seems it's full of dignity. There's nothing shameful about it. But is there a feeling of shame when you write about it?
Yeah, the whole process of writing for me is basically of like splashing around in a bath of shame for like 5 years. So, I mean, it's a joke, but it's also true, you know? Like, shame is the gravity that pulls me to a subject. And so, and the process of writing is one of confronting shame. I mean, I don't know if anyone here has ever experienced shame, but when you run away from it, it chases you, right? And so, for me, I think when you keep things secret, they bloat in your consciousness. I don't know, for me, I'm a very secretive person. And I think the culture teaches us to be ashamed of our wounds. And so I like to keep secret the things that have hurt me and the ways that I've hurt other people. And in secrecy, they become this like hideous, monstrous things, right? And so sort of concretizing them, fitting them into a narrative structure, like looking at the parts that we've been looking away from for a really long time, for me is incredibly liberating, because they're just things that happened, you know? And the story of shame is one that I'm telling myself, really. Nobody else is really backing that up. So, you know, I often think of writing like the process of molting, right? So do any of you watch Stranger Things? Okay, so I just finished watching, put on your earmuffs if you haven't. I mean, this isn't really a spoiler, but so there's just like creatures that molt in the second season and leave behind these like disgusting, slimy skins when they move into like a larger, stronger form. And I feel sort of like the book is the sloughed skin, right? So if I want to change or grow or get smarter or become more capable of intimacy or whatever it is that I want to move toward as a human being, the process of writing about things is one of sort of like peeling away that shame so that I can move on to the next form. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I mean, it really like I literally could not speak about the things I wrote about. Like I to no one, not even my therapist in many cases. And then you write about it, and now I have a completely different relationship to it.
So you mentioned that you start writing everything thinking that you're writing it for yourself, and then you kind of go through this process. How many things do you finish and say that was for myself?
Not a lot, actually. Some, you know. Mostly the reasons that I decided not to were out of consideration for other people. You know, I don't know. I'm sort of selfish. Like when you write something and you work really hard and you excoriate, you know, like, and you make what you think is also a beautiful piece of art that can help people. You really want to put it out into the world. So it's hard not to do that. But I've had the experience of hurting people that I love with my work. And so it's a careful decision, and sometimes it hasn't been worth it. Maybe a couple more? Okay.
Hi, so we read one of your essays, and we made our best discussion on the semester. So I wanted to ask you a question that came out of it, which kind of positions you as an expert in a way that I have to apologize for. But you read about Real God coming away and relates against the kind of life art question.
Mm-hmm.
And the question we started to talk about is what do you do with an artist whose life you find reprehensible, or who does things that you don't want to support, but whose work you continue to admire. So it was. So I just wanted to ask you what you think about that.
I mean, It's a really good question. I take it on kind of a case-by-case basis. It helps if they're dead. You know, like like I would have trouble sending royalties and contributing to the further accolades of an asshole, but if they're already dead, it's fine. And we can talk about their failings also. Like I think that it's naive or disingenuous to say that you can keep those things totally separate. I can't, I can't enjoy James Brown the same way that there's so many artists. And so part of it is, I don't know, I guess it's negotiating what I am getting from the work, right? And what it's taking away from me. And I think that I'm constantly measuring that, right? Like I enjoy as much as the next person watching a gory, well-written, long story arc television series, right? But I cannot have any more images of mutilated women's bodies in my mind. I can't do it, And so I reached a tipping point where I could no longer put any more of that into me because it was taking more than it was giving, right? But I'm not interested, and I don't think sort of as a rule that I'd want to deprive myself of the things that art gives me because someone's a jerk, you know what I mean? Like that would be like punishing myself twice, So I feel like people, you can all make your own decisions. It would be easy if there was a rule, like once we find that out, we need to be character detectives and then, but that's not, it's not that simple for me, But if they're living, it's harder. It really does sort of
One of
state
my
it.
students suggested we should steal or the work of
Yeah.
bad people if they're living.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, I think Bukowski's books are the most stolen books in existence, which is fair. Anybody else have any questions? Okay. Thank you guys so much.